ship is reacting to us and the reactions are getting stronger.
What are you telling me, that this ship is alive?
Welcome back to another video, everybody. Today's video is going to be a review of a movie that's kind of old. It's about 30 years old. It's kind of a cult classic within the horror community itself. It's a pretty controversial film. That film is Event Horizon. Now, if you know anything about this movie, this is a pretty divisive movie. There's people who either really love this movie, there's people who hate this movie. Critics kind of shit on this movie when it came out. That's why it's kind of not known. And regardless of the way it was perceived at the time, over time it's kind of garnered a little bit of a cult status where you have a lot of horror fans specifically who really like this movie. They think it's an underrated gem. The general public, I feel like, is still kind of sleeping on it. It was a big budget movie at the time. I'm pretty sure it flopped. And over time, this movie has really aged well in the eyes of a lot of people, myself included. I mean, aside from a couple of the CGI scenes they go for, a lot of positives to this movie. I just rewatched it this weekend. I felt like I should revisit it, do a review about it. So let's get into it. As I said, Event Horizon's almost 30 years old now. It came out in 1997, and at the time, it was a very, risky movie, the way they tried to make it, because it was a sci-fi horror movie. It was a director's cut that just doesn't exist anymore, and it was supposed to be this extreme practical effects, super gory, super scary, and people have always wanted to get released. I'm pretty sure it just doesn't exist, and the director said it will never happen, but us horror fans are, optimistic that eventually we'll be able to see the footage. But at its core, what this movie is it's like a sci-fi thriller mixed with a haunted house ghost story that takes place on this ship called the Event Horizon. And along with his crew for the rescue expedition is a doctor who actually happened to build the ship, the Event Horizon, played by Sam Neill. What you have you have this guy who's familiar with the ship. They're trying to figure out what happened to the crew, why everybody can't contact them. And as I said, when you get to the ship, there's some weird stuff going on. Nobody can find the crew. There's no logs from the crew. It's almost like they didn't exist. So what you have is a little bit of a haunted house mystery, a sci-fi thriller, a lot of cerebral visuals, people trying to figure out what happened to this ship 7 years ago and why they can find it now. And the first thing about this movie, if you were to IMDb this movie, kind of look it up, see what it's about, is this movie is absolutely star-packed, especially for its time. It's got Sam Neill, Lawrence Fishburne, Jason Isaacs, Jolie Richardson. I could keep going. There's a ton of names that went on to be huge successes in Hollywood. They're all in this movie, so the cast is amazing. And that was something that was actually really fun again about rewatching this, is every time I would see one of these people, I would be like, I feel like I recognize that guy. We'd have to pause the movie and kind of discuss, look him up on Google and be like, oh yeah, I knew that guy was from something. And it was literally every actor in this movie. So you got Sam Neill in this movie. He's playing a doctor. He's the guy who designed the ship. And there's something off about him in this movie. I feel like that's kind of what he got relegated into the roles of after Jurassic Park. And he's telling the crew that something interesting about this ship is it possesses the capability of time travel from point A to point B in the universe instantaneously, which would basically solve interdimensional travel immediately. And if you've seen the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about, but I feel like the way they kind of explain the time travel, whether it's loopholes or not.
Of a secret government project to create a spacecraft capable of faster than light flight. The ship doesn't really go faster than light. What it does is it creates a dimensional gateway that allows it to jump instantaneously from one point of the universe to another light years away.
Where's she been for the last 7 years, Doctor?
That's what we're here to find out.
Thought it was kind of cool. Lawrence Fishburne plays the captain of this crew. He's kind of the one who holds it all together because you have a bunch of oddballs in this movie. Everyone's kind of a character. You have a funny comic relief. You have the engineer. Basically the most, to its core, standardized crew you could have. But that's what also makes the characters memorable, is they all kind of serve a purpose. And the best thing they do in this movie about Lawrence Fishburne's character is he's not a complete dumbass, and I love that. He's the most sensible character you will see in any of these movies, where anytime something weird happens, anytime somebody overreacts, asks him a silly question, he just sets him straight immediately because his character is not written to be a dumbass. Always appreciate that. And as I said earlier, to its core, this movie really is like a haunted house on a ship, which I really appreciate. I'm always a fan of whenever they can take it out of a house or a cabin, put the atmosphere somewhere else. I think it's really sufficient here. Because it's like a haunted ship, you kind of have a little bit of an Oculus vibe throughout the movie where everything's very cerebral. The crew is seeing things. People don't know what's real, what's not. People aren't believing one another. And I know for some people that's a turnoff specifically, but for me, I've always been a sucker for it. So whenever they can kind of keep me confused about what's real, what's not, I get invested. For the times, I definitely think this movie does a good job of that. I think it really kind of keeps you on your toes. You're not really sure what's real. It does just enough kind of scary visuals and stuff to keep you invested until the end. It doesn't really blow its load too early. Whenever I watch this movie, something I thought was really unique about this movie, and it's probably a product of the times given that it came out in 1997, is that it's very story driven for a haunted ship movie. It's not, filled with jump scares, things like that. You spend a lot of time getting to know the characters, the differences between them, you know, traveling to the ship, start learning about the past of the ship. They really spend a lot of time, you know, establishing the groundwork of what happened to the crew, what happened to the ship. And I really appreciate that because I feel like a lot of movies, especially modern horror movies, they're so, you know, over the top with jump scares, trying to get you invested, like scared early. They kind of lose the plot a bit. There's definitely a part of me that really misses like the late 90s, early 2000s vibes of horror movies where they spent a lot of time on the atmosphere of the horror and they weren't so worried about visual scares. I mean, you get to that eventually in this, but I don't know. At my core, I'm always a fan of a plot and the story more than the scares, even though I am a scary movie guy. When you get to the final half hour or so of this movie and things start coming together, you start figuring out what's going on, things like that, I definitely think it pays off. I think the practical effects are great. And it's very impressive to me that in 2024, the practical effects held up. And I think that's why a lot of fans, including myself, really wish we could have got the director's cut of this because they have some really cool stuff they're doing. The story obviously starts explaining stuff, you start figuring out what's going on, and the whole entire final half hour or so is just batshit crazy. There's some wild visuals in this, practical effects, very Hellraiser-y. And it's funny because I watched this movie with a person who kind of doesn't like Hellraiser, but I don't really think they remember it correctly. I was trying to explain to them that like what this movie becomes is what they think Hellraiser was, where it's like very visual, like razor cuts, chains. And obviously not everything is aged well with this movie. There's some stuff that's really wrong with the dialogue. I mean, Sam Neill's character has some cringy lines, but I overlooked it. And the limited amount of CGI they do use, I don't think it's bad really, especially for the times, but in 2024, I mean, it definitely doesn't look good. There's worse movies. I mean, you can overlook it. It's not that prevalent in the movie. So I'm happy that they did choose to go with practical effects for the vast majority of this and the way they filmed it and the way it was edited. I feel like that was the smart way for it to age well. As always, I try to avoid spoilers in my videos, but this movie's almost 30 years old, so if you haven't seen it yet, pause the video, go watch it, come back, whatever, but I'm going to talk about a little bit of spoiler scenes just because I thought they were kind of cool, and that was your 30-year spoiler warning in advance, so here we go. When we get to the end of the movie, Sam Neill's character, the weird doctor, I really like the visuals they use with this guy. Some of the scenes where he's pulling his eyes out, he's got the Hellraiser cuts across his face, the editing choices for the flashbacks to show nightmares, I loved it. I thought that shit held up so good even in 2024. And as I said earlier, Lawrence Fishburne not being a dumbass, his character, I really like the way they choose to make him like savvy at the end and not like, you know, sacrifice the crew doing stuff he knows he can't do. He has to blow it up. There's no other way out of it. The only clear negative to me about this movie is it gets a little too hammed up with comedy towards the end of the movie from the Cooper character who kind of gets lost in space and comes back. I feel like if they would have cut back on that a little bit, I would have thought the ending was a little bit more intense. You'd have been like more invested in the scares of it, but like there's a couple scenes in this movie that are like straight out of a Kevin Hart movie, and I thought that was kind of weird. But yeah, I felt like this movie deserved a review. I mean, after watching this movie a handful of times, I feel like it gets no love, no mention, but I'm not that high on it, but I do think it's really good, especially for its time, and it doesn't get enough respect. But yeah, if you're like a horror junkie like me and you haven't seen this movie somehow, I definitely recommend this movie. It is kind of like a hidden gem from the late 90s. You should definitely check this out. It's got some good stuff going for it, especially gore, practical effects. And as I said, I'm really disappointed we're probably never going to get the director's cut of this because of the studio interference that removed it. Because on top of what we already have in this, if it would have got a little bit more heavy into the horror, a little less story, and they would have added the 30 minutes that we're missing, I think this could have held up as a really, really good cult classic. But regardless of that, definitely a good time. Definitely recommend you check it out if you haven't. It's a good watch. So obviously it's a bit old, but if you guys seen this movie, comment down below, let me know. If you have, where do you stand with this movie? Are you on the hype train? Are you one of the defenders who thinks it's a great movie? Are you one of the people who thought this movie stunk like the critics did? If you haven't seen the movie, have no plans of doing it, let me know what your favorite thing that Lawrence Fishburne's in, because he's badass in this. I love that guy. And as always, I'm going to put a link to all my other videos up here if you want to watch me drone on about scary stuff any more than this video. If you haven't already, subscribe. What the hell are you waiting for? And if you're a fan of scary stuff, scary movies, there's going to be a lot more stuff coming, so subscribe, because I'm going to keep doing those. New releases, going to be a good blend of those. That's all I got in this video, guys. As always, take care. Peace.